Thanks very much for that introduction, George. First of all, I really want to congratulate and thank the organisers of today's meeting with such determination to get this together despite all the intimidation and threats and the attempt to cancel this meeting twice. So just a round of applause for the organisers. It's absolutely vital that we are standing our ground and taking a stand today, because there really could hardly be a more important task for people like us who live within NATO countries to stand up and speak out against this aggressive military alliance which has caused such great human suffering, death and destruction in Afghanistan, in Libya and in Ukraine today. The Western governments and the Western mainstream media want to smear us, they want to ridicule us, and they ultimately want to silence us. They do not want an alternative opinion to their pro-NATO, pro-war narrative. But we really cannot allow ourselves to be coward. We have to raise our voices and say no to NATO, no to war, and yes to peace. Today, we meet in London today, the heart of British imperialism. And as we know, Britain has been a key partner of the United States in its brutal wars in the Middle East and North Africa, which have killed and displaced millions of people. So much for human rights. What utter hypocrisy that they say they support human rights. Today, Britain once again is following the lead of Washington, moving on from the devastating war on terror, so-called war on terror, to play a leading and hawkish role in the new Cold War, which explicitly aims to stop the peaceful rise of China and preserve US global domination. This new Cold War is destabilising the entire world, and as George said, there's actually a majority across the world that are against this because it's increasing instability, it's increasing threats to peace, and it's making people a lot worse off. And it has already brought a devastating hot war to Europe in Ukraine. And we really have to be clear about the following. You're not going to read this in the mainstream media, the opposite is what you'll hear, but the greatest threat facing us today, the greatest threat to humanity is the warmongers in Washington and their lackeys in Britain and other NATO countries. We are living through perilous times. The US is simultaneously escalating a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia and at the same time increasing aggression against China with an enormous military build-up in the Pacific, and it's vital that we play our part in building an international movement against these massive threats to humanity. So just on the war in Ukraine, this is a tragedy. This has caused tremendous human suffering, and finding a political solution to end the conflict through negotiations is absolutely vital. If we're going to find a political solution, it's crucial to understand what caused this war. It's decades of NATO expansion, bringing an aggressive military alliance right up to Russia's border, that has caused this war. US interference, including a coup in 2014, which installed a pro-NATO regime in Ukraine, has caused this war. The 8-year civil war following the US coup, which saw NATO powers arm Kiev and Ukrainian fascists in order to carry out attacks on the Russian-speaking population in the east of Ukraine, has caused this war. And having caused this war, you're not allowed to say that in the media, that's banned. They've caused this war, and instead of pushing for negotiations and a political solution, which is what is urgently needed to achieve a lasting peace, the United States, Britain and Europe are escalating this proxy war. They are pouring billions of dollars, euros and pounds worth of weapons into Ukraine to prolong the war. And the explicit goal of US foreign policy makers is to use this proxy war to weaken Russia. So, in other words, the Ukrainian people are just cannon fodder to advance the geopolitical goals of the United States. So why does the US want to weaken Russia? So it has to be said that the United States does not want any country in the world to pursue an independent foreign policy. I don't need to go through the countless coups, wars, proxy wars and so on that the United States has launched to achieve regime change all across the world and to install US puppets that will subordinate their countries to Washington. But this, of course, also applies to Russia. But it's not just about that. This is about the US Cold War against China too. The Biden administration believes that if it succeeds in weakening Russia, a country that is very large and has serious military power, this will strengthen the US's ability to attack China in the future. So what we have at the moment is not only this escalating proxy war against Russia, but we've also got the Cold War against China, which is really heating up. I imagine most of you haven't been able to avoid this in recent weeks, but the Western media has been focused on hyping up the alleged threat posed by a solitary Chinese balloon that was blown off course into US airspace. There's been a furore about this over the balloon. It sparked a diplomatic crisis, and incredibly, the United States has deployed advanced, very expensive weapons to deal with this balloon. So I'm really sorry to say it, but this balloon crisis is quite simply hot air. Yay. Sorry, the jokes won't get better. They won't get better. But in all seriousness, this is a manufactured by the United States to whip up hostility to China within the United States and create an atmosphere of tension in the world. And Britain, of course, is joining in with this farce. We had our very own Prime Minister declaring it will do whatever it takes to keep the country safe from balloons so we can all sleep soundly. We've really got to understand that the US and its allies are attempting to prepare public opinion in the West for a possible hot war with China. I mean, how devastating would that be for humanity? And Washington, I mean, this is the news, balloons, 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 but what Washington's been doing in recent weeks is working with key allies in the Pacific region to escalate the military encirclement of China in preparation for a potential hot war in Asia. So instead of embarking on a policy of international cooperation to solve massive problems like climate change, the entire US political establishment is uniting around a very aggressive policy aimed at stopping the rise of China. So I just want to take a moment, the extraordinary economic, social, technological rise of China, bringing over 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years. I mean, the Western media say, but at what cost? But at what cost have you brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty? Anything that China does, there's a negative spin on it. This rise of China, this peaceful rise of China, is regarded by elites in Washington as an existential threat to their global hegemony, and they are prepared to do whatever it takes to stop China, and they are contemplating methods which could endanger every single person on this planet. Because the United States is losing economic competition to China, but where the United States is strong is on the military terrain, and that's where it wants to push its confrontation with China. So, just on the facts of this, the United States spends more on the military than the next 9 countries combined, has over 800 military bases across the world, and a very large stock of nuclear weapons. How many foreign military bases has China got? 1. The US has got 400 military bases surrounding China, and we're told that China's the threat. I mean, you just couldn't make this stuff up. I just want to mention the latest briefing of the No Cold War campaign, which is called Taiwan is a Red Line Issue. You can find that on our website, which is www.nocoldwar.org. And this addresses the question of, is the United States wanting to turn Taiwan into the Ukraine of East Asia? So, just to be clear, Taiwan is part of China. This is a reality that the international community overwhelmingly recognise, including the United States officially. And there should be no doubt that moves by the US to encourage Taiwan's independence would represent an attack on China's sovereignty, and the Chinese government has been totally clear that such an attack would be a red line which the United States shouldn't cross. Now, we know the United States likes to cross red lines, such as the expansion of NATO, which is just done against Russia. So the new House Speaker in the United States, Kevin McCarthy, is now planning a visit to Taiwan in order to deliberately provoke and whip up international tensions. I think we have to vigorously oppose this visit. the United States is also calling on other countries to join in with its military build-up against China. So Japan is remilitarizing, doubling its military budget in the next 5 years. Australia is bringing in US long-range bombers and spending billions on US-made weapons and advanced missile systems. The US is gaining access to another 4 military bases in the Philippines, and Britain obviously has to get itself in on the action with military pacts with both Japan and Australia. NATO's General Secretary, also getting in on the act, has visited South Korea and Japan recently with a clear agenda of whipping things up against China. So having already caused a major war in Ukraine in terms of NATO, there shouldn't be any doubt that NATO interference in Asia can only bring further threats to world peace and prosperity. I just want to finish up with talking about building a movement against the warmongers, and I think it was really important what George Galloway was saying about we shouldn't see ourselves as a minority. I think we are. I think because of the blanket propaganda, it can feel like we're very much in a minority in NATO countries, but internationally that is not the case, and we have to really remember that. And obviously the more the truth gets out, the more that we can build forward. But we've got to be clear that building a movement against these NATO warmongers is a crucial task, because the United States is on an incredibly aggressive path. I would say a war path against 2 nuclear-armed states. And this really does have the potential to escalate into further hot wars and, of course, a nuclear war. And the consequence of that would just be truly catastrophic for all of humanity. The costs of this war in Ukraine and the new Cold War against Russia and China are huge. Tens of thousands of people have already paid the ultimate price with their lives in Ukraine, and many more will lose their lives if this war continues to escalate. We need negotiations, we need a political solution to end this war, and we need a lasting peace, not war weapons and escalation. Hundreds of billions of dollars, euros and pounds are being spent on weapons for Ukraine and in the military build-up against China. These are enormous sums of money, absolutely enormous, and they're needed to fight the cost of living crisis, for wages, to tackle climate change, for health and education, and for economic development all over the world. And yet, NATO is pushing for more and more military spending at the expense of ordinary people in the United States, Britain and Europe. We've got Britain's Defence Secretary demanding another £11 billion for the military. This tiny island is already the 4th largest military spender in the world. What on earth would we need another £11 billion for? And apparently there is no money for public sector workers that are striking, for fair pay, or for properly funded public services. And the same thing is happening in France. A 40% increase in the military is what Macron's just announced, but there's savage attacks on pensions, savage austerity across the board. In Denmark, it's really explicit. They're cutting a public holiday and they're saying, we're doing this because we want to increase military spending. And then 50,000 people went out on the streets and said, no, you're not doing that. I mean, this is the ridiculous, grotesque situation that we're facing in Europe. There is always a magic money tree for war, but not for the people. And millions of people in Europe are protesting against austerity, but it's really vital that we make the connection between austerity and war. We've got to make that. So finally, I just want to say, we've got to be saying loud and clear, we want money for people's needs, not the war machine. No to NATO, no to war, yes to peace.
Bravo! Whoa.